From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right, we have a jam-packed evening here, so I'm just going to dive right in and get started. So I am Betsy Peterson. I'm the director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you to a very special edition of the Benjamin Botkin Lecture Series. This evening, in various ways, we're going to explore the legacy of a very special person in the history of the library and the history of the American Folklife Center, Alan Jabbour. Alan passed away on January 13th, 2017, and I'm happy to see so many familiar faces and also many family members of Alan and Karen Jabbour are here, and I especially want to welcome them. And I will actually probably let you stand, and if I do not get all of your names, please forgive me. But Karen Singer Jabbour and daughter Rebecca and Aaron, daughter and son of Alan and Karen, please stand. And their spouse and children. I know there are many siblings of Karen, and I think there are family members of Alan here, so please stand up. We would love to say thank you and welcome. Before introducing the speakers, I want to say, as we know, Alan was the founding director of the American Folklife Center. And in that role, he was a direct successor to Benjamin Botkin, head of the library's folklore section in the 1940s. So it's appropriate that we're presenting this evening event of talks and music about Alan as part of this series. The series also allows us to present and highlight the work of the best and leading scholars, experts in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural heritage. It also allows us to enhance the collections of the American Folklife Center. And for the center and the library, the Botkin lectures form an important facet of our acquisitions activities. Each lecture is videotaped, as you can gather with these bright lights, and it becomes part of the permanent collections of the center. So the lectures are going to be posted later as a webcast on the library's website, where they will be available to people throughout the world and for generations to come. So if you have noisy cell phones on right now or anything that might ring later, please turn it off at this time. So Alan, being the director of the American Folklife Center from 1976, I think September of 1976 through June of 1999, that was only one of many roles that Alan assumed throughout his lifetime in his efforts to preserve and carry forward folk cultural traditions. Alan was a musician, an artist, a native Floridian, a Southern gentleman, a writer, an administrator with a vision, folklorist, researcher, president of the American Folklore Society, a member of numerous boards, and so much more. Our speakers this evening will be addressing many of these different facets and aspects of Alan's contributions. But before I introduce them, I did want to mention one dimension of Alan's work that I think has received very little attention over the years, and that is Alan's work to raise the profile of philanthropy and giving for the folk and traditional arts. Alan came to DC and the federal government in the 1970s, and we know that was a very heady and sometimes turbulent time for cultural heritage and preservation legislation and government support. And Alan and several other folklore luminaries at that time, Archie Green, Bess Lomax Hawes, and Ralph Rinsler among them, were right there at the very beginning, and they helped build this foundation for several public folklore institutions. And perhaps Alan's work at the National Endowment for the Arts as an initial head of the folk arts program provided a window for him to understand the importance of support, and not only to provide needed financial resources, but also to lend legitimacy and validation to the diversity of folk and traditional culture in the United States and beyond. But with so much emphasis on public support, Alan and others, Joe Wilson, Archie Green, also recognized the critical importance of galvanizing and strengthening private and individual support for the grassroots vernacular culture that we all hold so dear. Alan and others helped to found the Fund for Folk Culture in 1991 and held the planning meetings right here in the library. Alan was the first chair of the Board of Trustees, and in that capacity helped guide the direction of that fund to serve as an advocate and liaison for the field of folk and traditional arts with private philanthropy. In that role, over about a 15-year span, they steered well over $10 million of new support to the folk arts field, which is pretty amazing. And in his work at the Folklife Center, Alan also established several endowments and gift funds to support the work of the center and others and individuals to do their work. The Ray Virginia Allen Fund, the Blanton Owen Fund, the Gerald and Corrine Parsons Fund, and of course, the Henry Reed Fund for folk artists. On the occasion of Alan's retirement, Alan and Karen Jabbour, with several other individuals, established the fund, the Henry Reed Fund, in 2000. It honors Alan's musical mentor, West Virginia fiddler Henry Reed, and provides support for folk artists or to projects benefiting folk artists, whether it be a program, a recording project, providing opportunities for artists to do research and to work with other artists. Since 2004, the Henry Reed Fund has provided awards to 10 individuals. And I know we have several individuals here tonight, perhaps some Henry Reed recipients, but I know we also have many individuals who have given to the Henry Reed Fund, and I truly want to thank you for doing that. I also want to acknowledge Henry Reed's son, Dean Reed, who is here with us tonight, and Henry Reed's grandson, Terry. If you would stand up, we would love to. And I also want to encourage, if any of you are feeling that you want to extend Alan's legacy and honor Alan's legacy by contributing to the Henry Reed Fund, there is a flyer outside the door that will give you the information about how to do that. Please feel free to talk to me or any staff member. And actually, that reminds me, while I am up here, to thank all the American Folklife Center staff for all the incredible work they've done to put this together. They all very much, all of us very much want to honor Alan's legacy. So thank you, AFC staff. But now on with the program. To tell you more about Alan and the work that these individuals have done with Alan over the years, we do have several friends, research partners, family, who are going to share their memories and observations with us tonight. We are also going to end with a great old-time music jam, which I think is very fitting. Many of us have spent time with Alan very late into the night and the early morning listening or playing music with him, so I think it's only fitting that we end this evening with that. We will be making announcements about that and what to do. I know Thea already mentioned property passes. It's very important, as I'm sure some of you know. So our first speaker is going to be Carl Fleishhauer. And Carl was one of the first employees of the American Folklife Center and one of Alan's closest collaborators for decades. He was a field worker on many of AFC's field documentation projects in the 1970s and 80s. In the old-time music world, he was crucial to documenting the Hammons Family, which was a project that he worked on with Alan. He's also known as a top bluegrass photographer and has published a book. Prior to his recent retirement, he worked on various aspects of digital preservation in the Library of Congress, and that's actually probably putting that very mildly. He was instrumental to bringing digital preservation to the library. He has now returned to the American Folklife Center as a volunteer, yay, and working on the digital preservation of AFC fieldwork projects, which is a series of projects that Alan and Carl spearheaded and masterminded. So, without further ado, please, let's welcome Carl Fleishhauer.
Thank you, Betsy, and I'm pleased to be here. What I'm going to talk about, as Betsy suggested, is Alan as the leader of the center from its start, a little about his thinking, activities at the center, and policy development in federal cultural sector. The study and performance of music that Alan did so well will be the subjects of the next presentations. Let me start with Alan and strategic planning. This is a bureaucratic exercise that tends to repeat at regular intervals. I should know after 40 years here at the library, preceded by work in a university and on the boards of some nonprofits. All too often, staff or board members are put through agonizing committee discussions that yield impenetrable documents written in bureaucratese. Not so with Alan. Even as the center first took shape, planning moved forward in semi-formal two-way conversations with the center staff and the Folklife Center board. Alan listened as much as he imparted insights and information. He was an inveterate telephone caller, especially before email was prevalent. As ideas took shape, Alan had two advantages over most of his conversation partners: solid experience at the library, gained when he was head of the archive of folk song from 1969 to 1974, and a sense of the federal context for cultural activities resulting from his work at the library and as the head of the new folk arts program at the National Endowment for the Arts from 74 to 76. That work was under the estimable Chairman Nancy Hanks, and I remember a conversation from that period. "Here's how it works, Carl," Alan said. "If the letter awards a grant, Nancy signs it. If it says, 'No, we're sorry,' then I sign it." Translating plans into action sometimes required staff members to read between the lines. For important matters, of course, Alan conferred with the center's board and with the library chain of command, often, but not always, aligned with one another. But for staff like me, some actions just seemed to happen. You could be surprised. Of course, usually they had been heralded by earlier discussion and marched in step with the center's mission, Archie Green's excellent wording embedded in the center's enabling legislation. But here's an example. Alan's academic background was rooted in music and ballad scholarship, and he wanted to be sure the center's program was as broad as the term folklife. Actions to advance this goal popped into view in Alan's early hiring. Adding Rusty Marshall to the staff. Rusty had been a student of Henry Glassy and was immersed in folk architecture and material culture. And Elena Bradunas, a Lithuanian-American with great insights into the evolving expressive culture of those who came from Europe. There was also carryover from a project that Alan helped launch when he was at the archive, Dick Spotswood's Folk Music of America record albums, work that flowed into one of the new center's first public events, the symposium and book, Ethnic Recordings in America. Speaking of ethnicity, Alan rarely talked about his own family history. But in 2007, a writer picked up his remarks about his field work with the Virginia fiddler Henry Reed. Reed's father had immigrated from Ireland, while Alan's had come from Syria. Quote, "Your family storytelling creates a felt connection between your past and your present life in America," Alan said. It's curious that my father was the immigrant, and I ended up being the most attentive person to certain cultural traditions here. Regarding communication, Alan's descriptions of the center's accomplishments showed a real knack for putting a range of events and activities into a coherent statement. The quarterly newsletter was an excellent vehicle for this and other topics, and for about 10 years, Alan made good use of the director's column. He once said, "The newsletter gives you news and views, and people tell me the views are the most interesting." On 3 occasions, Alan drafted reviews of the center's accomplishments, short ones at the 5 and 10-year marks in 1981 and 86, and a 17,000-word offering for the 20th in 1996. Free of bureaucratic jargon, these reports paint a picture of a successful program, upbeat and affirming to be sure, and here we tip the hat to Jim Harden, who edited the newsletter through this period. The center's agenda reflected a range of advice from multiple voices. Nevertheless, Alan was the nerve center for the ideas that were translated into action. Some were topical, like ethnic groups and material culture, while others concerned activities. For example, exhibitions, publications, and concerts. The first concert was staged within weeks of the center's establishment. When Alan wrote about it 20 years later, he signaled the value of the series, not only in terms of artistic expression and the celebration of community arts, but also in terms of support for institutional and congressional relations. The audience, Alan said, was, quote, dominated by library and Capitol Hill staffers, making it for years the center's public face on the Hill. Alan guided the center to other forms of public communication, such as a CD publishing venture with Rounder Records. And during Alan's first decade as director, the center began to provide access via the internet, finding aids before the emergence of the World Wide Web, and after 1994, online multimedia collections accessed via the web. Exhibitions illuminated subjects ranging from ethnic recordings to Nevada buckaroos, here with the Smithsonian, to folklife in Rhode Island, a photo display in the U.S. Senate office buildings. Exhibits provided visibility not only for the Senate, but also with the White House. First Lady Rosalind Carter and daughter Amy opened an installation on Georgia folk art and folklife in 1978, while President and Mrs. Reagan opened the American Cowboy exhibition in 1983. During the 1980s, as center director, Alan attended meetings of the World Intellectual Property Organization to discuss intellectual property and folk expression. His article for UNESCO's Copyright Bulletin noted that copyright law focused on the rights of an individual or incorporated entity, in contrast to the way that in many traditional communities, creative expression is seen as belonging to groups. Protecting folklore, Alan wrote, means acknowledging an intermediate sphere of intellectual property rights between individual rights on the one hand and the national, international public domain on the other. In terms of legal history and legal frameworks, this is a radical idea. Meanwhile, as we look back, our attention is often drawn to the center's fieldwork projects. Alan staged more than a dozen from 1977 to 1994, rural and urban, like this New Jersey pair in the Pinelands and in industrial Patterson. These were team projects with mostly youthful workers, although the 1979 team in Rhode Island included Professor Kenny Goldstein, wearing the white shirt in this team meeting, in a project that was led by our recently departed colleague, Peter Bardis. May he rest in peace. These were generally survey projects lasting a month or two, some cooperatively with the National Park Service, some with state arts councils. Alan often visited and participated. Field projects were integrated into the center's program. In addition to exhibits, products included David Taylor's book on Italian Americans in the West from a multi-state survey, Charles Wolfe's double album of Blue Ridge religious music, and Mary Hufford's evocative web collections from West Virginia coal fields, and more. Meanwhile, for Native American music, the Federal Cylinder Preservation Project came first, fieldwork came second. Cylinder recordings of the Omaha tribe were created by Alice Fletcher and Francis LaFleche between 1895 and 1905. In 1983, Alan visited the Omaha Indian Reservation to share copies with the tribal council and to seek agreement on selection and publication. When he played some examples, 2 elderly men were present. When John Turner began singing, Alan wrote, I knew we were home free. Soon the center published an album, documented 2 Omaha powwows, created a website, and co-hosted by the tribe's cultural representative, staged a performance at the library. The fieldwork projects contributed to policy development, most strikingly in relation to historic preservation, where the federal legal apparatus expanded from the 1960s to the 1990s with a fresh interest in what was called intangible elements of cultural heritage. In 1977 and 78, National Park Service Director William Whalen was on the center's board, and Alan worked with Park Service representatives to frame up a field project on the Blue Ridge Parkway to provide material for park interpretive programs. In later cooperative projects, like the 1983 Pinelands Folklife Project in New Jersey, the center provided not only support for interpretation, but also for Park Service planning efforts, including land use concepts that were sensitive to neighboring communities. By the 1980s, Alan wrote, National Park Service planners, quote, represent a new generation of professionals who have been gradually abandoning the acquire, control, and manage model for national parks and exploring models for cooperation with local communities, operating on the premise that local people should be enlisted, not evicted. In 1985, the center joined Utah's Historic Preservation Agency to carry out a field project in Grouse Creek, and in 1987, a Park Service project in Lowell, Massachusetts. Meanwhile, the impact of the early field projects influenced the center's recommendations concerning historic preservation policy in Ormond Loomis's 1983 report, Cultural Conservation, the Protection of Cultural Heritage in the United States. The field projects added to the library's holdings of archival collections. Their organization, description, and preservation received a boost in 1978 when the Folk Archive was brought into the center. Founded by Robert Gordon in 1928, the archive had long been part of the library's music division. Alan used his skills as diplomat and negotiator to find an acceptable arrangement for that administrative move. When Alan talked about the fieldwork projects, he emphasized their debt to New Deal era work, the Federal Writers Project, photography from the Farm Security Administration, and of course the work of John and Alan Lomax and their cohorts, Herbert Halpert, Sidney Robertson Cowell, Ben Botkin, and Charles Seeger, a personal favorite of Alan's. These predecessors, Alan wrote, modeled, quote, a documentary cycle, fieldwork, collection building, and subsequent public outreach. And as we have seen, Alan pushed the center, quoting him again, to recycle documents back into cultural use. Alan continued to enact this cycle in his retirement years. In the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Alan, with Ted Coyle and Karen Jabbour, documented cemetery traditions, especially the celebration of Decoration Day. The work was initially for an environmental impact statement, a push for the recognition of non-Native American traditional cultural properties in the environmental impact process. Alan's work with Karen Jabbour, his wife of 55 years, represented documentary recycling of another sort, repeating their teamwork from the 1960s when Karen and Alan visited the Virginia fiddler Henry Reed and other folk musicians. Their joint effort in the 2000s yielded their engaging and thoughtful book, Decoration Day in the Mountains. I'll close with a paraphrase of Alan's own tribute to Ben Botkin, the man for whom this lecture series is named, adjusting the words a bit to celebrate Alan's final phase of life. His official Washington career was over. Neither his personal accounts nor those of others suggest any deep unhappiness with the tensions of administrative life in the federal maw. He continued to be a public folklorist, now in a private capacity. It had been a vigorous period in the American cultural enterprise, and both Alan Jabbour as an individual and the American Folklife Center as a cultural institution were at the very epicenter of the enterprise. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carl. That was wonderful, and it's wonderful to see all these incredible photographs. And the photographs that we saw earlier during the reception, many of those are from the field survey projects that Alan and Carl did. Now we are on to our next speaker, a gentleman named David Furchgott, and who I have not personally met, but I know he is a contributor to the Henry Reed Fund and also runs an organization that Alan served on the board, International Arts and Artists, sort of going back to some of the comments that I made earlier. So David, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In 1974, I was working for the South Carolina Arts Commission, and my responsibilities there included coordinating the first National Endowment for the Arts funded multi-state project. We were documenting the local folkways of the South Carolina Lowcountry using methodology which would be simultaneously used in Mississippi and Kentucky. Alan, as the director of the National Endowment for the Arts' new folk art program, flew to South Carolina to meet me. I picked him up at the Columbia Airport and we drove 2 hours to Charleston to view the programs. That drive and conversation was fascinating. It was my first exposure to Alan. And like practically every other conversation we had throughout the subsequent 42-year friendship, it was enlightening. In an era prior to the internet and Google, Alan was not only familiar with music and the material culture of Charleston, my hometown, but then he also knew more about my family's history and historic connection to Jacksonville, his hometown. I never left a conversation with Alan without learning something new. His interests were broad and his knowledge was encyclopedic. In thinking back to that 2-hour drive and our original meeting, I later realized that he could have easily flown directly to Charleston to meet me there. But I'm sure that Alan wanted that car time to get to know who I was. Within the context of this tribute to Alan's legacy, I felt it was very important to mention the breadth of Alan's impact went far beyond the traditional music and folk life communities that he loved so dearly. In his work as the first director of the folk arts program at the NEA in 1974 to 1976, Alan helped bring the arts to millions and millions of people. And he did it in a way that they could understand, touching the very fiber of who they were and where they were. Additionally, Alan personally and directly affected the lives of hundreds of people like me, who were then working across the U.S. as we could to carry that same message. Here in D.C., Alan was on the board and co-chaired the Humanities D.C., which was from 1987 to 1988, which is the local affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Nationally, he also helped organize the Alliance for American Quilts from 2001 to 2007. And he facilitated starting the Quilt Alliance's National Documentation Index. He served on the boards of the Alliance for National Heritage Areas, the European Center for Traditional Cultures, and chaired the Fund for Folk Culture, as Carl mentioned, from 1991 to 1994. And closest to me, Alan served on the board of International Arts and Artists for 14 years. He was our board chair for 7.5 years, 3 successive terms from May 25th of 2009 until his death last year. He guided International Arts and Artists, an organization that focuses on sharing cultures, through the recession and through a lot of organizational growth. He encouraged the organization to reach out to the broadest range of cultures from other nations, as well as to all American ethnicities. We lived around the corner from each other as well for 25 years. Throughout all of these involvements in every aspect of his life, Alan was demanding of himself and yet showed tremendous kindness and patience with others. He was erudite and yet in the most folksy manner. He always spoke endearingly and proudly of his children. His love of Karen and his appreciation of her intellect and her unwavering support was evident throughout their remarkable half-century of marriage. I wanted to thank him in front of everyone, a dear friend who I miss greatly. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Now I want to call up to the stage Ken Perlman, who many of you know, and was also a partner of Alan's and is considered to be one of the top clawhammer banjo players in the world, known in particular for his skillful adaptations of Celtic tunes to the style. And he draws his material from traditional sources, including the music of Scotland, Ireland, Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and the American South. But his approach to the music is highly innovative. Also, as an active folklorist, Ken has spent over 2 decades collecting tunes and oral histories from traditional fiddle players on Prince Edward Island in eastern Canada, which has resulted in 2 books and a 2-CD anthology of field recordings. He has toured throughout most of the English-speaking world, sometimes with Alan, and in Western Europe, both as a soloist and for over 15 years in a duo with Alan Jabbour. So, oh, you are right behind me, okay. I didn't know if I needed to kind of stall, but I don't. So, without further ado, Ken Perlman.
Well, thank you so much. Before I start, I'd like to thank Karen Jabbour for the great honor of speaking here to remember Alan in front of so many wonderful people. Alan and I toured together. Okay, this is the, okay, got it. Sorry, technology. Alan and I toured together for nearly 15 years. We first encountered each other musically in August 2000 at a music camp in the Rockies. His official accompanist bowed out at the last minute, and given that I was the resident old-time banjo picker, he asked me to accompany him in his concert set. From the moment he touched bow to string and we started playing together, there was a strong musical affinity, an uncanny blend of fiddle tone with banjo tone, along with the sharing of sensibilities and tastes. His approach was strong and powerfully rhythmic, but fully lyrical and delicately phrased, even charming. As soon as I heard him interpret a tune, even one I had heard around the scene for years, that instantly became the definitive version for me, and one I wanted to emulate. He inspired me not only to learn many dozens of his tunes note for note, but to develop a whole new way to accompany them that fit his style like a glove. This melding of fiddle and banjo can be heard on our first CD, Southern Summits, and joined by guitarist Jim Watson, I guess, who couldn't make it at the last minute. He was going to be here tonight. On the CD, You Can't Beat the Classics, which was completed just a few months before the onset of Alan's last illness. I'd like to go back to slide 2 for a minute, and here's a little sample of the sound that we developed together, a tune called Waynesboro. Just a little excerpt. can still remember our recording it here in Washington 10 years ago. After a few visits back and forth, Alan and I started touring, and until the state of his health intervened, we toured or worked together at music camps at least 3 or 4 times a year. Our travels took us to England, Ireland, Scotland, and Shetland, Western Europe and Canada, but mostly we toured regionally in the United States. Depending on the season, our travels took us to the Northeast or his native Southland, the Pacific Coast, or the Midwest. In what was probably our longest tour in the fall of 2010, we started out in Atlanta, curved through Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky on up into Michigan, headed northwest past Chicago to Madison, and then back to DC via Indiana. And here's another picture from that era. Touring with Alan was an eye-opening experience. He was a much-loved and respected figure, renowned not only in the folk and acoustic music worlds, but also in the world of academic folklore, as you've heard. Even in a room full of perfect or near strangers, he had only to walk in to command attention, and most folks would emerge from any given social occasion deeply impressed with his wisdom and charm. He considered himself to be as much a storyteller as a musician, and his song intros at concerts were often quite elaborate. Nevertheless, be a player right now. Nevertheless, audiences hung on every word. When he led jam sessions, participants would eagerly follow wherever he led, even if they had never before heard his selected tune or tune version. Although Alan was never a full-time musician, he made incalculable contributions to the music world. While still a graduate student, he took his reel-to-reel recorder off to the Piedmont and Southern Mountains and preserved the music of several important roots fiddlers on tape, most notably Henry Reed of Monroe County, West Virginia. He learned quite a number of those tunes on fiddle and began teaching them to a coterie of musicians in and around Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Along with Bertram Levy, who is here tonight, Babbie Thompson and Tommy Thompson, he founded the Hollow Rock String Band, whose recordings and concerts launched the contemporary old-time music revival. The Hollow Rock Band and other products of the Chapel Hill scene, such as the Fuzzy Mountain String Band, you can tell the era, and the Red Clay Ramblers, same, introduced many, many tunes to the old-time scene that have become beloved classics. Among these tunes are Over the Waterfall, Frosty Morning, Kitchen Girl, Ebenezer, which Alan usually called West Virginia Highway, Magpie, and Green Willis. As you've heard, he became the founding director of the Folklife Division here at the Library of Congress in the 70s. In that capacity, he promoted music and other folk arts and supervised the recording of many additional roots musicians, most notably the Hammons Family of Pocahontas County, West Virginia. He also had to interact with many notable business leaders, philanthropists, and politicians of the last quarter of the 20th century, a factor that led to many interesting conversations during our long drives between tour destinations. Thinking back on the many stories and anecdotes that Alan shared during our travels, I recently got to thinking that perhaps one overarching theme to describe his life was the notion of the quest. What brought him to North Carolina in the first place was an impulse to study someone else's quest. The topic of his dissertation was the story of Beowulf. Once there, he became intrigued by the study of folklore and ballads, and inspired by the search for child ballad melodies among the singers of Appalachia, and drawing on his background as a highly trained classical violinist, he embarked on a years-long quest to locate and record Appalachian fiddlers and preserve their tunes. Alan started with Piedmont players like John Lewis, and then headed deeper into the mountains. He encountered a fiddler named Oscar Wright and found himself deeply drawn to his tunes. Wright told him that the source of those tunes was old man Henry Reed, who not only was still living, but could easily be tracked down in Glen Lynn, Virginia. Alan often told the story, you've seen that picture before tonight. Alan often told the story how he and Karen drove up to the Reed residence for the first time late one afternoon, knocked on the door, and were immediately invited to partake of a large family dinner, despite, as Alan puts it, that Reed had no idea who we were or why we were there, to emulate his gestures. In any event, after dinner, the tape recorder came out, and numerous tunes were recorded, including one called West Virginia Gals, that Alan said moved him so deeply his musical life was changed forever. His next quest was learning the tunes and translating them effectively to fiddle. Now, you should know that it's not easy for a classically trained violinist to play fiddle music. In fact, nowadays we often make fun of such people. The bowing is completely different. Liveliness and rhythmic attack are far more important than soaring tone and following a conductor's directions. Nevertheless, Alan watched and listened to the old-time players he met and figured out not only how to play these tunes effectively, but to play them so compellingly that they attracted a coterie of collaborators, entranced a generation of musicians, and launched a musical revival. This said, his take on the tunes changed as he went through life. Judging from the first hollow rock LPs, his early playing was strong and lively, but as the years went by, it acquired a delicacy of phrasing and lyricality that were truly unique in the world of contemporary folk music performance. And I was very fortunate to come along right at the moment that this unique approach to the music was coming fully into its own. Alan loved playing with strong, innovative banjo pickers, and working with him served as a great inspiration to numerous influential banjoists. Tommy Thompson, there on the right, developed a highly percussive, semi-melodic picking style to drive the hollow rock string band sound, and carried that style into the Red Clay Ramblers. Many, many banjo pickers who came up during the 70s and 80s cite Tommy's playing as one of their main formative influences. Bertram Levy eventually put aside the mandolin he played in his Chapel Hill days and took up five-string banjo. And as he re-explored the hollow rock repertoire, he developed a new approach to clawhammer that can be heard, merged with Alan's fiddling and James Reed's guitar playing on the CD, A Henry Reed Reunion. And that's Bertram on the right, he's here tonight. And then in the 90s, banjoist philosopher Stephen Wade, who is also here today, and you'll hear from him very shortly, was one of Alan's favorite musical collaborators, and in fact, a CD made from one of their live performances has just been issued. Alan used to tell quite a number of stories about the tunes we played, some of which reflected on the vicissitudes of collecting a repertoire and then observing from a distance as individual tunes became disseminated. He always regretted, for example, that he never thought to ask fiddler John Lewis about the spelling of the tune title, Rose Division. He wrote down R-O-S-E like the flower, but was later left to wonder, could it actually have been R-O-W-E''S, or even R-H-O-D-E''S? You may remember this musing. Alan later found out from, he often talked about a quirky amodal tune, originally recorded by Reed with no title, but dubbed Texas by the Hollow Rock crew when they put it on an LP because of a story that Reed had told. Can we hear that left audio, please? Okay, so Alan later found out from Reed that the real name of the tune was Newcastle. But despite years of trying to correct the nomenclature, people in the old-time music revival could simply not be budged. as far as they were concerned, the name of the tune was Texas, and that was that. Another case that bemused him involved a very sweet lyrical tune in the key of G, again collected from Henry Reed with no title. Can we have the other tune on that slide, please? Anyway, Alan included it on a tape he sent out to the West Coast, positioned right next to another tune called Lady of the Lake. Somehow things got conflated, to use one of Alan's pet expressions, and the G tune started spreading on the West Coast under the title Lady of the Lake. Years later, Alan was able to trace how the tune with its newly minted name moved from fiddler to fiddler until its original provenance was forgotten, and it got into the hands of a well-known contradance fiddler from New Hampshire named Rodney Miller. Miller recorded it on an LP called New England Chestnuts. And from that time on, virtually everyone in the folk scene has assumed it was an old New England tune. This said, as it happens, the title Lady of the Lake fits the tune perfectly, and the melody is far better suited for contradancing than it is for Southern square dancing, so no harm done. Alan often compared the function of tune collectors to the workings of an hourglass. In an earlier era, a given tune might be known by many musicians. Then, as the music culture declines, there are fewer and fewer players, and the number of people who know the tune shrinks, sometimes to as few as a single person. When the collector comes along, hopefully before that last grain of sand has disappeared, he or she teaches the tune to others. It then comes back to life and spreads again, sometimes becoming even better known than it was in the first place. No tune is a better case in point here than Over the Waterfall. It was collected from Henry Reed, its single known source, and spread so quickly and pervasively that few people nowadays have any idea where it came from. It first appeared as cut number 7 on the B-side of the first Hollow Rock LP. Not long afterwards, Alan moved to LA and was asked to judge a fiddle contest at nearby Topanga Canyon. One of the contestants, not knowing who was judging, announced that he was going to play a tune he had learned from the Hollow Rock String Band called Over the Waterfall. As Alan put it, that tune beat me to California. Flash forward about 15 years, Alan and Karen were in Hungary attending a music party held in conjunction with an academic conference. A band from Brittany was on center stage when the word got out that the tall American played the fiddle. Alan was 6'6" in his stocking feet. In Alan's words, I saw the band members talking among themselves, and I guess they were probably saying, what song do we know that the tall American might also know? Finally, the young woman who served as band leader turned to Alan and asked brightly, can you play Over the Waterfall? Anyway, here's the version of Over the Waterfall from the Hollow Rock recording that on that when that fateful cut was made. Maybe we'll get a chance to play that in the jam session. Anyway, I'd like to conclude by playing Billy in the Lowland, and this is a tune that Alan and I felt was the best vehicle for capturing the essence of our sound, and the tune we almost always use to open our concerts. Not surprisingly, it was collected from Henry Reed, who said it was originally from East Virginia, which is the way that West Virginians refer to what is now called the state of Virginia. Thank you. I think I better think a little tuning would be appropriate here. It is a banjo after all. Very much.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I also want to say that there are some CDs in the back by Ken, both, and by Stephen Wade, who we will hear from in just a second. They are recordings that are with Alan, so if you would like to hear more, please go back and get a copy. I'm also looking forward to hearing more music very shortly. It's wonderful to hear the full dimensions of Alan being talked about here. For some of us folklorists, we get sort of mired in the academic and the words, and it's sure nice to hear words with music. Our next speaker is Stephen Wade, and many of you know him. He has spent nearly his entire life in the study of American folklife, and he's probably best known for Banjo Dancing, a theatrical performance that combines storytelling, traditional music, and percussive dance, which was one of the longest-running off-Broadway shows in the country. Here at the library, we are particularly appreciative of his book, The Beautiful Music All Around Us, Field Recordings and the American Experience, which showcases nearly 2 decades of research during which Wade tracked down the communities, families, and performers connected with the iconic AFC field recordings and do indeed demonstrate how important research is. The book received the 2013 ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and the Association of Recorded Sound Collections Award for Best History. Wade has released a number of award-winning CDs, of which the latest is Americana Concert, Alan Jabbour and Stephen Wade at the Library of Congress. So please give a warm welcome to Stephen Wade.
Alan and I, we always opened all our shows with this tune here. We started playing together. I met him in mid-70s, and we started playing here in DC in around '82. You're ready there? All right. That's Sam McLeod, and he was a good friend of Alan's too. When my wife and I got married, Zan and Alan played that. Thank you very much. Well, as I said, Al and I opened our every concert with that tune that he called Stony Point. But it goes by more names than that. These include Old Dad, Wild Horse, Kelton's Reel, Pigtown Fling, Unfortunate Dog, Buck Creek Girl, Richmond Ruckus, and when Earl Scruggs recorded with Paul Warren, they called it Fiddle and Banjo. Back when we performed it, Alan noted there'd always be some accommodating soul, he said, who would call it the Wild Horse at Stony Point. I thought a way of approaching this tune without Alan here to lead it might reside in that banjo there made during the Civil War. The history that dwells in this instrument and the past lives who once held it calls to mind a remark that Alan often made about Quint Stillion, a fiddler and fifer from the Mexican War, who as an old man taught a young Henry Reed, who then decades later guided a youthful Alan Jabbour. Only one person, Alan marveled, stood between himself and that misty figure of Jacksonian America. That tenacious thread, still intact, extends to those here tonight who in turn learned their music from Alan, and thus ancestries become continuities. The epigraph of this new album, a concert that Alan and I played at the Coolidge Auditorium 20 years ago, comes from something Alan wrote. He said, "How complicated and powerful beyond our own imaginings are the radiations of what we do." Alan's thought applies not only to the influence his repertory had upon others, but within the music itself. Alan exemplified an approach that Indiana fiddler John W. Summers, a contemporary of Henry Reed's, called the originality of the tune. That is, that each piece possesses a detailed identity. Dick Summers saw it as the fiddler's obligation to learn however many parts a tune might have and to take no shortcuts in their execution. Similarly, Buddy Thomas, a Kentucky fiddler committed to the older styles, felt the need to bow the tune out. The influential radio fiddler Georgia Slim Rutland likewise spoke of his mother's counsel when he first started playing. She said, "Don't ever detract from a tune. Add to it all you want, but don't take away." These musicians shared in common a view of fiddle tunes as complex, self-contained works, and that's how Alan crafted his pieces. Tonight's invitation also asks us also to consider Alan in relation to his legacy in folk life. When Alan began his graduate studies at Duke, his classroom professor sometimes played selections from the folk music albums issued by the Library of Congress. These performances, many recorded in domestic settings, did not scrub away the sounds of those places. In the background, sometimes a dog barks, a kitchen clock ticks, roosters crow, a truck drives by. These records alerted Alan to the kind of first-person collecting he soon undertook himself. Nor, in the ensuing years, as head of the Folk Archive and later as director of the American Folklife Center, did he divorce cultural expression from lived experience. Art is not a thing apart, he once told me. It can't be set aside from life. One song emblematic of that fusion and included on those albums that Alan heard comes from Vera Hall, a singer and domestic worker from Livingston, Alabama. In October 1940, she recorded for the library Another Man Done Gone, a blues she learned from her husband, recently returned from prison. While the well-known number most often appears as a lover's plaint, in her rendition, she largely sang spirituals, it seemingly becomes a civil rights anthem. In what could serve as a mission statement for the American Folklife Center, Vera Hall later said, "Any song that we sing have reference to the life that we live." Another man done gone. Another man done gone to the county farm. Another man done gone. I didn't know his name. 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 He had a long chain on. He had a long chain on, had a long chain on, he had a long chain on. I didn't know his name. 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 He killed another man. He killed another man. Killed another man. He killed another man. I don't know where he's gone. 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 Gonna walk your log. I'm gonna walk your log. I'm gonna walk your log. I'm gonna walk your log. Another man done gone. Another man done gone to the county farm. Another man done gone. We'll close with a medley. The first recalls a tune Alan played as Paddy on the Turnpike, though it too goes by other names. We follow with Kitchen Girl that Alan learned from Henry Reed and then transmitted to the world. And we end with Sheep Shell Corn by the Rattling of His Horn, a piece recorded in 1941 for the Library of Congress by fiddler Emmett Lundy. Lundy, born in Southwest Virginia in 1864, learned from a much older fiddler named Green Leonard. He said of Green Leonard, quote, "He didn't teach them tunes to me, but I catch them from him." And in his last days, he told me that I was the only one that tracked him down, and he wanted to learn me some old pieces before he died. He didn't want him to be buried and live after he was done. Sheep Shell Corn lives on through Emmett Lundy. He played it majestically, a description that applies as much to Alan Jabbour, this tall swan of a man, musician, folklorist, administrator, author, and inspiration to so many. A year now since he left us, Alan's courtly words resound. How complicated and powerful, beyond our own imaginings, are the radiations of what we do. Sam McLeod. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Zan. And we are coming down to our last speaker. I think the Jabbour family should always have the last word before we start hearing some music and playing music. So please do not go away. But to come down to the practical universe, if you do need to leave, there are staff at the back and will guide you to the elevators and make sure you get on your way. And for those of you who stick around and play an instrument and have an instrument with you, please don't forget about those property passes. We want to make sure you get out. And then finally, thank you, Stephen, again. Thank you, Zan. Thank you, Ken. And thank you, Carl. And thank you, Alan. Our last speaker is Karen Jabbour. She's Alan's wife, love, and lifelong research partner throughout his career. Their work together includes rich documentation of the tradition of Decoration Day, which was published in the book Decoration Day in the Mountains, and I think she needs no other introduction. Karen.
Good evening, family and many friends. Welcoming all of you here has reminded me of a generous reflection that Alan's first administrative assistant here at the American Folklife Center made. Eleanor Sreb said that her late husband didn't leave her a lot of money, but he left her very rich in friends. And I certainly feel rich in friends tonight. My thanks to the Folklife Center staff for their dedication in bringing about this tribute to Alan's legacy, and my heartfelt appreciation to Carl Fleishhauer, to David Furchgott, to Ken Perlman, and Stephen Wade, and Sam McLeod for their devotion to portraying for all of us in words, photographs, music, and their long creative interaction with Alan. Finally, thanks to you musicians who will continue the legacy in your tribute in the jam later tonight. As many of you know, when Alan retired in 1999, he took on a project offered to him by the National Park Service to create a study of the cultural tradition of holding cemetery decoration events for the environmental impact statement for a major road in Great Smoky Mountains National Park to the graveyards left behind by the people who were moved off the land. Without Carl to rely on for documentation, Alan drafted me as his field collaborator and photographer. I can take a picture. This is my photograph of Alan's, which has been very hard for me to look in the eye tonight because I know he's looking right at me. So after 2 years of attending these cemetery events, we submitted the study for the EIS volume with so much enthusiasm and documentation left over that we went on to publish a book in 2010 with University of North Carolina Press called Decoration Day in the Mountains, which has been mentioned tonight. This only whet Alan's appetite to continue surveying cemeteries with me throughout the entire rural South. And he completed before his death a second book, now awaiting my editing at the University Press of Mississippi. In the course of studying cemetery traditions, we researched allusions in literature, art, and song to cemetery events. Alan had a special place in his heart for slow airs called hymns, played by Southern fiddlers. When we were doing research at Berea College Library, he heard a solo version of the 19th century hymn, The Old Churchyard, played by Sanford Kelly. And he recalled an allusion in John C. Campbell's book, The Appalachian Highlander in his home, to a congregation singing this hymn in a processional to the cemetery. Alan noted in Kelly's playing the slow monophonic style and irregular pulse of the old unaccompanied singing style. I'd like to conclude by playing for you Alan's fiddling of The Old Churchyard, the final track on his last album, You Can't Beat the Classics. The words to the first verse are, "Oh, come, come with me to the old graveyard. I well know the path through the soft green sward. Friends slumber there we were wont to regard. We'll trace out their names in the old graveyard." Thank you, folks. And Ken will now organize the jam.
Okay, so here's a moment a lot of you have been looking forward to. What we're going to do is, everybody who's brought instruments, this is your time to go get them. And we'd like to make a clearing, kind of here, a big circle space that people can come and join once you've got your instruments, and others can sit around and listen or participate. But we'd like to clear some chairs right here and make an opening that people can sit around.
The first tune we're going to play is often called Ebenezer, and this is collected from Henry Reed, and was that on the first Hollow Rock album? It was on the first Hollow Rock album, and Alan said that Henry Reed often called it West Virginia Highway. And if anyone else has any memories to share. Okay, so we're going to start this tune. Do you want to kick it off? This is Bertram Levy, by the way, who original Hollow Rocker.
I should say right off the bat that this is Alan's fiddle.
Bertram, do you want to pick a tune? Yeah, for a little while. Yeah. Billy.
You know, Alan and I, we were like brothers. We grew up together with this music. I mean, Alan was kind of, he was the inspiration, but we were the three or four of us were the people that really kind of put it all together and made it come alive. And we shared the tunes, and we shared the whiskey and the camels, and we shared being bad boys, and it was a great experience. And I'll just relate one memory, which is once we went visited Henry. I was his sidekick, and I would go with him to visit some of these folks, and we visited Henry and took him down to Narrows. And we sat under a tent, and Alan was sitting here, and Babbie Thompson was sitting here, and I was sitting there, and Tommy Thompson was sitting there, and Henry was sitting there. And he hadn't been out of his house for many years. And people would all come up and offer him something to drink, and they'd point at Alan, they say, "Henry, that's you when you were young." So that was, we knew then that Alan had the right stuff. So this is a beautiful tune, which is John Brown's March. Remember, begins with a 4-chord on the second part.
Hey. Now, that wasn't a Henry Reed tune, was it? It was a... Marcy, do you have a tune that you'd like us to play? Well, okay. Shoes and, okay, we're going to do Shoes and Stockings. Do you know have any stories about that other than it's a Henry Reed tune?
I think we actually named this tune. I don't know, I think Henry had a name for it, did he?
Oh, the title.
Yeah, the title. There were many tunes that Henry didn't remember the title, or sometimes we'd play them and with the one title, and then he'd write back to Alan, and he'd say, I think that's a different title. But now that last time I talked to Alan, we were musing about the facts that during our working, we always wondered why the old guys never played the fiddle when they were working, when they were young men and only took it up again when they were older. And then Alan and I were musing about 6 months before he passed away, and we realized that we also picked up the fiddle again after we stopped working. And I said, Alan, we were those guys, and we didn't know it. We thought we were maybe documentarians or something, but we were just fiddlers just like them, and you probably are the same. So this is Shoes and Stockings.
I think while Bertram is trying to get the fiddle in tune, let me share something too. I've been lucky enough to live just a couple of blocks down from Alan, and we had a monthly jam going on my house, which is still happening. And Alan, whenever he could, would come along to the jam, just sitting in, leading it when he would, and very often basically if he was there, we tried to have him lead, but he wouldn't always do that. He'd encourage all the younger players to have a turn to play. And Shoes and Stockings was always the first tune we started, that we played, especially since everybody in that jam really liked the key of G. So Shoes and Stockings is it.
Okay. Do you have a tune you'd like to suggest? Green Willow. You want to go to D? The banjo players mind going to D? Okay. But that's all right. We're in the territory. Okay, so we're going to D, and we're going to play Green Willis. I've heard that before. But it was unclear if he meant the tunes or us. Okay, we're going to play Green Willis, and this originated actually as a jig called the New Rig Ship, a Scottish tune, and during the late 19th century became a fifing tune, like played as a march or quick step in the South, called Chapel Hill Serenade, and then it got sped up into a reel, and that's the way we play it now. So. To start, you'd be interested in knowing that.
Once Alan and I were sitting around with Libby Cotton, and she said, "I know that tune. We used to call that Chapel Hill Serenade when I lived there. We used to hear the fife and drum march down the street playing that tune."
Okay, so going around in this end of the circle, a D tune. How could we not? So you've already heard the story of this one. Do you know anything more about Over the Waterfall than what I've said? No, you had a story you wanted to tell about Alan?
All I know about Over the Waterfall is it comes from an old English ballad, and in which she tried to, she wanted to get rid of her husband, and so she gave him some wine and blinded him and sat him by the cliff. And then she said, just stand there. And she got back and she ran to push him over, but he was a crafty old guy, and he just stepped out of the way, and she went over the waterfall.
Okay, kind of in this end of the circle, anyone have a tune? Rocking the Babies to Sleep. Cool. You play that? All right, you want to lead it? Okay.
You know this Dean over here, he's the one who taught it to Alan, didn't you, Rock? Or at least you rocking the baby to sleep?
We're going to do Texas or Newcastle. Let's finish up with Frosty Morning. Everyone knows Frosty Morning. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. This is really a really fitting ending to the evening. Thanks so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.